Good evening and welcome to the second in our series of Antarctica In Sight Live, our series of webinars which explore Antarctica in a bit more detailed aspects, both familiar and perhaps less well known, and bring you experts to you to share their insights into this endlessly fascinating place. We are hugely grateful to our season partner Viking, who are generously supporting Antarctica In Sight Live this year. So thank you very much, Viking. My name is Camilla Nichol and I'm the Chief Executive of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, and I'm delighted you're able to join us tonight on this auspicious occasion as we mark 100 years since the death of Sir Ernest Shackleton in 1922. It seemed an irresistible and ideal opportunity to reflect on his legacy and those of his contemporaries and explore perhaps a bit more the notion of heroism, what it means for us today. What we have for you tonight are two experts who are going to share their thoughts and thinking on the heroic era of exploration, of Antarctic exploration, and ask what it took back then to be an Antarctic hero, what heroism looks like now, and what we can learn a century on from the era of Scott and Shackleton, Amundsen, and others. So I'm pleased to say they are happy to take your questions. So please post any questions that you might have in the comments, and please do that throughout, and we'll choose as many as we can to pose to our experts, and we'll get through as many of those as we can. But for now, it is my huge pleasure to introduce to you Ben Saunders and Henrietta Hammant.
Hi, Camilla.
Hi, hello, great to be here. Great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's brilliant to have you here, and what a day to get together. Ben, great to see you. How about tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, gosh. Well, yeah, I never really know how to introduce myself, which sounds silly. I'm usually introduced as a polar explorer, which obviously is a ludicrous job title in the 21st century. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an academic. I have spent 20 plus years leading expeditions in both the Arctic and Antarctica, so a lot of time dragging a sledge around to contemplate this topic.
Thank you. And Henrietta, tell us about you.
Hi. I'm a PhD student, and I'm interested in how Antarctic explorers are portrayed in museums in the UK, how museums think about Antarctic explorers and Antarctic history. That's me.
Excellent. A subject very close to my heart. It's great to have you both, and thank you so much for taking time out on this important day in the Antarctic calendar. What we are going to do tonight is that both of you have a short presentation to share with us a little bit about your work and your interest in Antarctica and Antarctic exploration, and then we'll have a good chat about heroism and all that means. So I'm going to invite you, Ben, first to take us away and tell us a bit about.
Perfect. Thank you, Camilla, and hello, everyone. I'm hoping my slides will appear. We were testing this out. Here we go. Right. So, as I said, my name's Ben. I'm a polar explorer. My careers advisor at school never mentioned that as an option when I was a teenager, trying to work out what I was going to do when I grew up. I'm 44 years old now, essentially still my gap year. Still trying to work that out, but I've led a dozen big expeditions now in the Arctic and Antarctica. I've spent about 2% of my entire life either north of the Arctic Circle or in Antarctica. Now, there's a wonderful book, highly recommended by Sarah Wheeler, called Terra Incognita, about Antarctica. And there's a line that I've got here on my screen from that book. Before she traveled there, she said, as far as I was then aware, the continent was little more than a testing ground for men with frozen beards to see how dead they could get. So I have frozen my beard many times over. I fear I'm going to be a sort of crash test dummy for this conversation, but I have skied solo to both the North and South geographic poles. I'm one of either two or three in history that have done that. Small club, two or three, depending on the trustworthiness of a mystery Russian in the 1990s before GPS. So small gang, and this is where I spent most of my career in these places. Now I'm going to talk to you, because we're sort of tight on time, about one journey in particular that was down here. Hopefully you recognise Antarctica, extraordinary place. Unlike the North Pole, which is in the middle of the sea, if you're daft enough to try and walk there, there are no maps. At least the South Pole is in the middle of land, and it's a huge bit of land. Antarctica is a continent, of course, roughly the same size as China and India put together, or two Australias if you include the coastal ice shelves. coldest place on Earth, driest place on Earth, highest altitude continent on Earth, windiest place on Earth. And between October 2013 and February 2014, my wonderfully named teammate, Tarka Le Pinier, half French, I guess, we very simply walked from the bottom of this red line, Ross Island, which will mean something to the Antarctic history buffs among you, to the South Pole, where we turned around and walked all the way back again. That will give you an idea of scale, 1,801 statute miles. If you look it up, the headlines at the time said 1,795, because that's the number on my GPS. I had an email from a scientist after we finished saying, Ben, you realize that number is almost undoubtedly wrong. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, GPS assumes the Earth is a perfect sphere, which apparently it's not. It's squished a bit at the top and the bottom. So he reckoned we had walked 6 miles further, which I was chuffed about. Anyway, 69 marathons back to back, roughly, except dragging sledges, not just running marathons. Best summed up, I think, by this Malaysian edition of Business Insider magazine. Two explorers just completed a polar expedition that killed everyone the last time it was attempted. Now, my mum has never been that happy about the trajectory of my career path, and the precedent for this journey did not look great. Of the 9 people in history who'd ever attempted to walk to the South Pole and back to the coast of Antarctica, none of them had made it, and 5 had died in the process. And the last attempt, of course, was led by second from the left Captain Scott. You will all know the story, I'm sure. Arrived at the South Pole to see this flag on the far left, black and white, so you can't tell, but it's a Norwegian flag, beaten by a matter of weeks by Roald Amundsen and his men, who used dogs and dog sleds. Crucially, they weren't walking, unlike Scott and his team, and indeed Shackleton's Nimrod expedition a few years previously. And all 5 of these men died on the return leg of that journey in 1912. Now, the last 3 to die, including Captain Scott, had covered nearly 1,600 miles on foot in the toughest place on Earth. So, and that's a record that stood until Tarka and I finished our very long, very daft camping trip in 2014. So to me, for years, it seemed extraordinary that the high watermark of sheer human endeavor, and let alone heroism and courage, but just purely as an athletic feat, it seemed extraordinary that every contemporary Antarctic expedition had been somehow shorter or easier than the journey made by these men. When Sir Ernest Shackleton and Dr. Mike Stroud did a sort of dogleg crossing of Antarctica in the 90s, that was 1,300 miles, so 300 miles shorter than the journey made by Scott and his team on the Terra Nova expedition. And to me, it was as if the marathon record or the Ironman triathlon record had been set in 1912 by someone smoking a pipe and wearing hobnail boots. And despite a century's worth of innovation, no one had raised that bar. Why was that? Because these people were, by our standards, so woefully ill-equipped. You can just about see in this image they have zips on their jackets because zips hadn't been invented yet. They didn't have vacuum flasks, thermos flasks to keep hot drinks warm during the day because they hadn't been invented yet. So let alone GPS, aircraft, synthetic materials, freeze-dried food, vitamin pills, protein shakes, satellite phones, solar panels, lithium batteries, all of these extraordinary advantages that I enjoy in the 21st century. How come no one had finished that journey? So that's what we set out to do. Now, a few people said, why didn't you do it properly, Ben? Why don't you don't take a GPS, eat the same food, wear the same, sleep in a reindeer skin sleeping bag? I didn't entertain that thought for long, partly because if you look at Scott or Shackleton or Amundsen or Nansen, they were all using the best technology they could. So we were an emphatically 21st century project. Off we went, basically following the route that was pioneered by Shackleton on his Nimrod expedition. But both he and Scott and their respective teams traveled across the Ross Ice Shelf, which is about the same size as France, roughly, except unlike France, no hills, no valleys, no cheese, no wine, nothing at all. 28 days in a straight line. Our journey, we spent 108 nights down there, living in a tent, which was an interesting insight into what it must have been like, and I can come back to that in the questions later. Our journey took us up and down the Beardmore Glacier, discovered and named by Shackleton, of course, on his Nimrod expedition. Largest valley glacier on the planet. We didn't have much data to go on. This is Tarka sat on his sledge holding a 1965 US Geological Survey chart of This enormous glacier took us a week to get up it. Turns out he and I are the only living people to have walked all the way up and all the way down the Beardmore Glacier. And here's going back to Sarah Wheeler's words, us seeing how dead we could get. I lost 22 kilos in 3.5 months. Taka lost a bit more than that. So again, I can talk about the sort of misery and suffering later if you'd like me to indulge you. Heading back down the Beardmore, back across the Ross Ice Shelf, finally finished 108 days later. This is the finish line. That would have been exactly the same finish line for Scott or for Shackleton. There's what's called a working crack. So the ice, you can see the two sledges are on the ice. That's the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf, and the grey, rocky, rubbly shore is the shore of Ross Island. Captain Scott's hut, which Discovery Hut, is just over that ridge near McMurdo. People in black and orange are scientists from New Zealand. Scott Base is just down the coast of Ross Island. So that was it. We'd done it. We still hold the world record. It's on my downstairs, on the wall of the downstairs loo. Longest ever polar journey on foot. But that's my career in a nutshell. That's my last slide. I know there's loads I've missed out, but we're super tight on time. I've gone over the 5 minutes I promised, but hopefully that's a useful start up in 10 and a bit of food for thought and discussion later on. And Camilla, back to you.
Thank you very much. Amazing. I mean, I'm freezing cold, hungry, and it's like exhausted just listening to that. So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to exploring that a little bit more in due course. But can I bring Henrietta back to share your perspective on the heroic era of exploration? Great to have you.
Sure. Oh, thank you very much. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for that, Ben. That was amazing, and it's always great to hear about these things from someone who's actually been there rather than my just having been there a lot in books. So here we are, the Antarctic heroes. Now, my name is Henrietta Hammant. I'm just going to hope that my slides click on. Is that going to work? Oh, maybe some technical wizard. There we go. We'll sort that out for me. My name is Henrietta Hammant, and I am, as I said, currently studying for a PhD in the anthropology of heritage at the University of Reading. And anthropology can be a bit of a slippery, if you'll excuse the pun, subject to explain. But really it's about people and it's about culture. And anthropologists like to ask how people are the same and how they might be different around the world. And I am specifically a museum anthropologist, which means that I'm interested most of all in the people who work in, who volunteer at, who go to visit, and who are on display in museums. And in particular, as you might have guessed, I'm interested in polar museums and the way that they represent heroic age Antarctic explorers. Now, let's see if we can move to the next slide. There we go, the heroic age. Now, the heroic age is a really specific period of time when it comes to Antarctic history. And it's a term which we usually use to describe the years spanning the late 19th century all the way through until Shackleton's death 100 years ago today on the 5th of January 1922. It was when Shackleton and Scott and the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, amongst others, were venturing south. And it's also when many of the first great adventures were taking place in the Antarctic. It was when people first made it to the geographical South Pole and to the magnetic South Pole. The first buildings were erected during this period, and work was being done to uncover the geography of the Antarctic and to understand the human body's responses to the extreme cold encountered on those earliest expeditions. In short, there was a lot of real historical significance taking place in the Antarctic at this time. So this brings us to the first question. Here it is that I'd like to address in this talk, and that is, what did it take back then? What exactly was required to be amongst the first European, we might come back to that, the first European men to visit the icy continent? Well, I think one of the best ways of thinking about this is through a very famous advertisement. Now, the story goes that Shackleton posted these rousing words in the Times newspaper. It said, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honour and recognition in case of success." So stirring stuff, and certainly enough, we might imagine, to encourage a few hardy heroes to get in contact. But now I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but in spite of much searching, any proof of this advert having actually been listed has been impossible to come by. And in fact, the earliest reference to these words comes from a book published in the 1940s, more than 20 years after Shackleton's death. But I still think that it's worth our attention because even if it is just a wonderful fake, it tells us quite a bit about the heroes of this era, or rather the characteristics that we value when we talk about them. We want them to be tough and up for a challenge, hardworking, honourable, and in search of glory rather than financial reward. But why does it matter what we want them to be? Surely a hero is a hero, however you look at them. Well, this is something that I don't think is strictly true. And that's illustrated by the fact that both Shackleton and Scott, perhaps the two most recognisable figures of the heroic age, have both been seen as more and less heroic over time. In fact, their heroic trajectories have almost gone in opposite directions. So, first of all, let's turn to Scott. When the news, I think there is a picture of him somewhere, here he is. When the news reached England that Captain Scott had died on his return journey from the South Pole, having been beaten in his race to be the first man there by the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, he was celebrated as a hero who had given his life in the pursuit of glory for Britain. But over time, his autocratic leadership style fell out of fashion, perhaps because of the social upheaval of the world wars. And after the wars, new ideas about masculinity and emotional vulnerability left Scott looking buttoned up. And soon, instead of a glorious martyr, people began to see him as something of a difficult figure with views that were a bit old-fashioned. Shackleton, on the other hand, started out with a less glittering reputation, especially after his Imperial Transantarctic or Endurance expedition, where his men had been on the brink of disaster, and I'm sure we can talk about that later. Yes, he did, spoiler, save them in the end, but as the expedition took place between 1914 and 1917, almost the whole timeline of the First World War, people wondered whether gallivanting around the Antarctic was really what he should have been doing at that moment, especially while plenty of seemingly ordinary men and women had proven themselves as heroes during the same period while staying much closer to home. After Shackleton's death, though, his leadership style, which had been so much more egalitarian than Scott's, came into fashion, and people from around the world even began trying to recreate his adventures. Slowly, he was thought of more and more favourably, with his reputation as a hero sitting all the more comfortably as a result. So, what does heroism look like now? Well, this is the fun bit, because if we understand whether or not someone is a hero can actually change over time, then I think it might be possible to consciously shape our definition of a hero so that we can include a greater diversity of people. And I find this a really exciting idea because Antarctic museum collections, and in particular those related to the heroic age, seem to a lot of people to be inherently lacking in diversity. We have records of the people who ventured to the Antarctic at this time, which document that the vast majority were white, male Europeans. But just because women, people of colour, and to some extent LGBTQ plus individuals were not on the ships to Antarctica doesn't mean that they weren't actively involved, and often heavily involved, in the processes which made these expeditions both initially possible and later commemorated by the British public. To illustrate this, let me welcome you to the Polar Museum at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge. And this is the site of my fieldwork, most of my fieldwork. And I'm bringing you here because I think that the history of this place can tell us a lot about diversity and Antarctic heroes. Now, as I've mentioned, in 1912, Captain Scott's attempt to be the first man to reach the South Pole ended in tragedy, with his death and the deaths of the 4 men who accompanied him to the pole. And as a result, there was a national outpouring of grief, which was harnessed by the polar community in the UK to raise funds for what would become the Scott Polar Research Institute. And Scott's wife, Kathleen, was instrumental to the success of this endeavour. securing major funding from various streams, and even introducing the Institute's male founder to a host of contacts who would ultimately make the idea a reality. And once established, the Scott Polar Research Institute was designed to be a memorial to Scott and the men who died with him on their return from the South Pole, as well as a scientific base for data gathered in the polar regions to be processed and understood. It was also somewhere where future generations of polar explorers could come to learn about the poles by studying their predecessors' expeditions and their expedition kit. And much of the extensive learning collection required for this was donated by the wives and the female relatives of the explorers who had passed away on Scott's expedition. Now, these women understood the importance of these objects, both for other explorers and for the nation as a whole. And in turn, the fact that the men's personal objects were now part of a museum collection, not just in family care, conferred a certain status on the explorers who had originally owned and used them. And once they were in the museum's collection, the objects were catalogued and cared for by a Miss W.M. Drake, whose work, though voluntary and largely overlooked, so much so, in fact, that I'm still yet to find out what her first name was, her work continued to produce these objects as worthy of care and of preservation. So all these acts of donation and curation reinforce the image of these men as heroic figures, worthy not only of the admiration of their peers, but of generations to come. And for a striking example of the diverse stories hidden in individual objects in Antarctic collections, like those held at the Scott Polar Research Institute, you need look no further than these Inuit-style snow goggles. In the Antarctic, the sun's rays bouncing off the ice and snow can be so intensely bright that it can cause snow blindness, which is essentially sunburn for your eyes. It's really painful, and the men on the expeditions would have wanted to avoid it at all costs. So they turned to a group who have been avoiding snow blindness for thousands of years, the Inuit, a cultural group who live way up in the Arctic. And the Inuit made goggles from wood or antler or bone, carved with a very thin slit to look through, which would reduce the amount of light that could enter the eyes. And this was such an effective solution that even though they tested many kinds of goggles during these expeditions, including ones with coloured glass like ski goggles, Scott favoured these Inuit-style goggles the most. And without the Inuits' intimate understanding of their world, technologies like this would have been far less effective for our polar explorers. And less effective kit may have meant less successful expeditions, with the men unable to push the boundaries of exploration that they could when backed up by proper equipment derived from real expertise. So, what lessons can we learn 100 years on? Well, for me, the most important lesson we can learn from Shackleton, Scott, and all the explorers of the heroic age is that heroes do not act alone. And actually, from the people who made the expedition equipment, all the way through to those who recognised its importance and worked to preserve it for the future, the cast of individuals involved in these Antarctic expeditions is diverse. And what's more, without each of these individuals working together in their own ways, the expeditions themselves might have looked very different, have had very different outcomes, and the men who went on them may never have been remembered, their reputations never becoming those of heroes. The Antarctic explorers of the heroic age are made up of a huge web of actors, including people, objects, and institutions. And by doing the work of uncovering these big networks, we can gain a deeper and more nuanced understanding of these heroic expeditions and all the heroes who made them possible, not just Scott and Shackleton. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Henrietta, thank you so much. I mean, fascinating insight there. And I think it poses a number of questions, I think, for us to discuss this evening.
I think so.
I mean, I think what's brought us together tonight, particularly, of course, is Shackleton. And you explained, I think, really clearly his legacy and how his reputation has changed, has certainly grown over the last century. I mean, what do you think? I mean, I'll pose this to both of you. I mean, what is it about Shackleton? I mean, he's somebody. I don't know about you, but I've got a picture of him on my wall. He's somebody that inspires a lot of us, and I suppose many of the people watching tonight, are here partly because of his reputation and his accomplishments. But what is it about him, his character, his accomplishments, his tragedy, his triumphs and failures that it's made his legacy endure? And why? I mean, you touched on it before a little bit, Henrietta, about how his legacy has grown. People have appreciated it much more over the last, certainly the last half century. But what is it about him, do you think, that just sticks so effectively? Henrietta, I'll put that to you first, and then you.
I think what is so great about Shackleton and what makes him so lovable, so likable, is that he's just such a human being. He is kind of fallible, and he doesn't get everything right, and he did end up when he was on the Endurance expedition, he made a series of amazing decisions which led the men to end up at Elephant Island, and then he was able to get them to South Georgia, and he made all these great impacts in kind of Antarctic exploration and Antarctic history. But at the same time, he's just a man. And I was thinking about this earlier because actually, one of the things that I like most about Shackleton is the idea that he went on the very first Antarctic expedition that he went on, the Discovery, which was led by Scott, because basically he wanted to impress his girlfriend's father. It was like he kind of wanted to look cool for his father-in-law, and he thought that would be a good way of doing it. He wasn't really that interested in the Antarctic itself, but he just thought that it would make him someone who was worthy of Emily Dorman. And I think that's something that we really like about him, that we can kind of appreciate his humanity, because he has all these very kind of human moments, and you can understand him, I think, quite easily, even through the histories that have made it this far to us.
I totally agree with that. I think there's a real human being there that gives less distance, I think, between us and him in that respect. And I think, not least because he gives a great quote and actually speaks a lot to what we think, what the things we wrestle with today, I think. I mean, Ben, what about you? What is it about Shackleton?
Gosh, good question. Personally, I think for a long time I sort of felt this weird affinity because I saw myself, correctly or incorrectly, as an underdog as well. And of course, Scott got all the institutional backing from the Royal Geographical Society. They gave Shackleton a token, bit of support, but he had to go out and find his own sponsors and backers and, corporate sponsors and private benefactors. And these were mega expensive projects, to organize. So he was an entrepreneur. He was clearly extraordinarily determined, not just in the sort of epic story of what happened on his endurance expedition, but even just getting these things off the ground. And even in the 21st century with aeroplanes, and it's a fraction of the expense of buying your own ship and having to put huge crew together for 3 years. But that's been the biggest challenge for me, and I can't imagine the scale of the challenge back then. And I think Shackleton also was, I called him an entrepreneur. I think he was ahead of his time in that he understood what we'd now call PR. I think Shackleton would have loved Instagram. Scott would have hated it. He was clearly a brilliant storyteller. He knew how to sort of bring this place to life to people that were never ever going to get to visit it. So a whole lot of things. I'm glad. The comments are bubbling away. I'm glad a few people have flagged the Ross Sea Party, because I think the sort of myth of Shackleton is that he's a hero because he brought all his men back alive, and that's not entirely true. And I even though we called this big trip I did in 2013 the Scott expedition, I didn't want to get too mired in the debate, which is still, people still argue now, Scott or Shackleton, the kind of Scott was a lunatic, Shackleton was a hero. It's far more nuanced than that. But I certainly identified with the sort of underdog who I sound quite posh, but that's entirely affected. And I went to state school. My dad's a bricklayer. I don't have a degree. There's no family money. I had to figure this out myself and raise all the money myself. So that was the part of the story that inspired me for years.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, Ben, you're an explorer. There's something in you that said, I need to do this. As Henrietta says, Shackleton was doing it to impress a potential father-in-law. I mean, what was it for you? What is it that said, I need to go and get thin and cold and tired?
It wasn't to impress a girl particularly. I think it was Robert Swan said for a while when he was asked the question why perpetually, he said, well, it's a great thing to talk to girls in bars. And Not entirely untrue, but the reality of my life for 20 years actually was totally, was just not conducive to healthy relationships at all. I am happily married now, but the last expedition was a few years ago. There's a wonderful line I've just dug out from a book by Barry Lopez. It's called Arctic Dreams. So he's talking about Arctic exploration, but I think it holds true. And he said, the literature of exploration is frequently offered as a record of resolute will before the menacing fortifications of the landscape. It is more profitable, I think, to disregard this notion that the land is an adversary bent on human defeat, that the people who came and went were heroes or failures in this. It is better to contemplate the record of human longing to achieve something significant, to be free of some of the grim weight of life. That weight was ignorance, poverty of spirit, indolence, and the threat of anonymity and destitution. This harsh landscape became the focus of a desire to separate oneself from those things and to overcome them. In these narratives, then, are the threads of dreams that serve us all. And I think, starting out 20 odd years ago in my early 20s, there was, if I'm being brutally honest, there was a lot of ego involved. I was 23 years old, my first North Pole attempt. I hadn't achieved anything. And I wanted to, and I think utterly naively thought back then that if I did something impressive enough and enough people said positive things about what I'd done, then I'd be happy. And I learned the very hard way that doesn't work out that way. And I have a very conflicted relationship with sort of celebrity these days. And I think I'm becoming sort of more and more private as I get older. But certainly 20 odd years ago, 2001, my first North Pole attempt, it was ego. I wanted to do something that I thought might be impressive, and I wanted to test myself and challenge myself. And I saw these places, the polar regions, as the sort of amphitheatre to go and do that in.
Yeah, no, I think that's compelling, and I think it's probably not true for everybody. So I think it's something in some people that drives, gives you that drive, for sure. I mean, Henrietta, the heroic era is peppered with these extraordinary characters who've led these tremendous expeditions, shown great acts of courage, leadership, and actually all the ordinary folk. You alluded to this in your presentation about it takes a team to achieve these things. I mean, are there people you think that have been overlooked, in the heroic era? We always talk about Shackleton, we always talk about Scott and Amundsen. I mean, a couple of people that you think we should be thinking a bit more about, reading a bit more about, understanding a bit more?
Oh my goodness, what a question. I really think this is kind of at the core of how I feel about heroic explorers and that word heroes. And I think we do need to kind of cast our net quite a bit wider, and just think about the people who facilitated things. Quite apart from I always think we should read more about Frank Wild. he's one of my personal favorites. He was Shackleton's right hand man, but actually at the end of the day, he was still there on those expeditions. People have heard about him, and he kind of, I feel like he's got some limelight which some other people haven't received. And quite apart from these very classic heroic era individuals, I think that we haven't been thinking about people from different parts of the world who were also kind of active in the Antarctic. And so recently, last year, I think it was, there was an article in the Journal of the Royal Society of New Zealand talking about Maori voyages to the Antarctic, very, very early Maori voyages. And that knowledge had been passed down through oral traditions. And they were suggesting that maybe the first voyages from the South Island had taken place in kind of the 7th century. And that information had come through carving and weaving. And so there's a whole kind of a completely different way of looking at the Antarctic there, which we're missing. And equally, there's evidence for people coming across from Chile. And so, I think as well as looking at our very much Eurocentric in some ways view of the Antarctic, we have scope to include these other people who'd already been. But also there are Indigenous people, people of colour, there are women, there are all sorts of different groups who were involved in those very specific trips to the Antarctic. So I think we have got a really nice picture behind the scenes of someone wearing a pair of Finesco boots which I've specifically asked so that I could show you them, because I think they're fantastic. They're those boots on the right hand side there with the lovely turned up toe, and these are they're an indigenous technology from the Arctic, so literally the other side of the world to the Antarctic. And here they are in, I think this is Scott's hut for the Terra Nova expedition, and they're wearing them because they work. I mean, there's no two ways about it. The reason for including these technologies is because they were simply the best thing to use in a cold climate like this. And they would have been packed with materials like sennegrass or hair from caribou, reindeer. And so these sorts of things have had to come from links with other kinds of people. And those are the things that we don't get to hear about enough, I think, because they are representative of the other people in these histories, in our collections now in the UK. And yeah, I think if we just look a little bit further outside the people who actually wrote the diaries, outside the autobiographies and all of those things, then we'll find that the whole world is connected to the Antarctic, which for me is really exciting.
I totally agree. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ben, you must own a pair of boots like that, surely. And if you don't, you ought to. I mean, I think the question of diversity is a really interesting one, isn't it? And you know, we've just in the last couple of days just been reading about the great accomplishment of Preet Chandri, who got to the South Pole a few days ago. Remarkable solo effort, and the first woman of colour, of course, to make that journey. I mean, diversity is incredibly important in the polar regions, and something that, you know, is breaking the mold of the great white continent, as often people say, and it's being the preserve of the beardy white men with their frozen beards. I mean, Ben, I mean, why is this important? Why is it important that people like Preet are getting a piece of this action and getting the publicity and the recognition?
Very, very good question. Preet and I were chatting late last year, where she was down in Chile and I was down in Argentina. I was about to get on an icebreaker. I can't bring myself to call it a cruise, but it was basically, and it was quite surreal. I went to South Georgia the first time, and it was just extraordinary seeing that, and then being on a boat that has a sort of a press button for for a frothy cappuccino or a flat white. And there's a hot tub, and it was all quite surreal. But Preet and I were meshing then, and yeah, you're absolutely right. She just skied solo to the South Pole from Hercules Inlet, so sort of Chilean side of Antarctica, 40 days, which is a cracking time. So really impressive achievement, just full stop, regardless of gender or skin color or anything. And I've had to slightly try and like my digital tongue and not wade into too many Twitter debates in the last 24 hours with people saying, well, why does it matter that she's a person of color? Why can't we just... And if you don't think it matters, I mean, my sort of default response today has been, well, go and watch the extraordinary film 14 Peaks about Nim's Perja and climbing all 8,000 meter. And he talks a lot about his pride at the fact that they were an all Nepali team, and it was very much a Nepali expedition. And Nepalis, of course, were always the porters and the Sherpas, and you've only look at Hillary getting a knighthood, and Tenzing Norgay got this sort of token George medal, like a little sort of honorary thing. So exploration, adventure, whatever you want to call it, as a field has I think for far too long been certainly as in the way that it's portrayed in the public, been dominated by people that look and probably sound a bit like me. So I think it's a wonderful achievement. And funnily enough, all the way back to my very first expedition in 2001 with Penn Haddo, he'd worked with a team. It was an all-female team that skied from Canada to the North Pole as a kind of relay, so sort of flying, doing each degree of latitude at the time. And he, at the same time, was sort of training, mentoring a team of blokes from the UK Special Forces, who I don't think their trip happened for whatever reason, but he said the women were just so much better out than the men, because when they got to the big pressure region on the ice, if one of the blokes went to help someone else, they'd be like, get off, I'm going to do it myself. And the women, he said, they would just flow over these obstacles, and even physiologically, actually women are really well cut out for this kind of thing, for sort of long steady travel in cold places. Women do it brilliantly. So I'm glad that Antarctica is finally being seen as a equal opportunities, not employer, but sort of venue for self-inflicted suffering. And also, serious point, one of the things I love about Antarctica, and I've sort of come to love as someone who maybe like Shackleton early on didn't really appreciate these places fully, and really just wanted a tough challenge to do something cool and impressive, and impress the father-in-law. One of the things I love about Antarctica is of course that nobody owns it. There are no claims of sovereignty. It's governed by this treaty, which compared to pretty much anywhere else on the planet means it's looked after remarkably well. It's the largest nature reserve on the planet. And one of the things I love the most is if and when you're lucky enough to rock up there one day, if you fly in or arrive on a boat, there's no border control. No one checks your passport because it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter where you came from. And that's one of the few places on the planet where all the stuff we bicker about, identity, nationality, immigration, borders, kind of doesn't matter as much. And the one thing that does matter down there is your ability to get on with your fellow human beings in a place that kind of necessitates that, because it's normally pretty challenging. So to me, there's actually a sort of utopian side to Antarctica that I think we could all benefit from learning from.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, just thinking about kind of modern exploration. I mean, in the last few days, and we know there's other expeditions coming up. And Ben, you lead expeditions frequently. I mean, what is it? Antarctic exploration outside the science programs has changed a lot, hasn't it, since Scott and Shackleton's era? These are often privately funded expeditions that are focused on sort of personal endeavour and accomplishment, and all the amplification of good causes, of course. I mean, what is it? What do you think the impact of these is today? I mean, people trekking to the South Pole. I mean, you did it, a very long time after Scott, and then many have gone after you. So I'll put that to you, Ben, first, and then to you, Henry.
Gosh,
what's the impact? What do these feats still inspire us?
Good question. I think Reinhold Messner described his entire career in mountaineering as pointless but meaningful, and I'd probably subscribe to that as well. And I stumbled. I never thought this could or would become a career, and in a way, it was sort of sheer desperation. I came away from my first expedition in so much debt, didn't get to the North Pole, came back, failed attempt, and got sent an invoice for my sort of remaining half of the cost. And the only way I could think of figuring this out was doing another expedition, and hope if I could hopefully raise enough money, I could sort of pay off a Ponzi scheme, So that's how it started 20 years ago. So it was just sheer desperation. And then I stumbled into speaking about it, and I felt for a few years, I felt very guilty that I was being paid rather well to rock up at these corporate events and talk to tech startups and sort of pharmaceutical companies, and I knew nothing about those businesses. I'm like, well, this is a bit embarrassing. I'm just telling some stories. And then I was on a call 3-4 years ago with CNN, who were looking at doing something in Antarctica. It didn't happen, but I was helping out with the logistics. And there was a lady on the call, producer, who said this line that just I've been plagiarizing and repeating ever since. She said, humans are narrative beings. We're not inspired by data. We're inspired by stories. And I suddenly thought, okay, phew. Oh, maybe there is some value in what I do, which is basically I'm a storyteller in many ways. And for me, I think, and certainly a big part of what I'm focused on in the future is storytelling. And I it's how do you bring this place to life? How do you tell a story that is sort of compelling and inspiring to people that are almost certainly never going to get to visit it? And that there is so much data coming out of Antarctic climate science, particularly, that is deeply alarming. And yet, how do you contextualize that? And I was trying to get my head around this a while ago. How much glacial freshwater ice is there in Antarctica? Well, the answer we have from satellite data and everything else is roughly 26 or 28.5 million gigatons. So a gigaton is a billion metric tons. So how can we think about that number? Well, I Googled a couple of years ago how many human beings are alive in the world right now. 7.8, 7.9 billion. So I thought, okay, well, if I divide up all the ice, how much ice in Antarctica do we have each? Is it 3 kilos? What's our individual sort of allowance as a way of thinking about it. The answer, and I've done this many times over, and I've checked this with some extraordinary mathematicians. The answer is about 3 million tons of ice for every human being on the planet. And I'm an ice specialist, and I know what 3 million tons looks like. Someone said last year, "Oh, that's about 10 aircraft carriers in terms of displacement." So the scale of this place is not only, when you're down there on a silly camping trip, not only is that completely mind-blowing, but also in terms of the consequence to all of us, is a story that needs telling better. So that's kind of where I'm going these days, in terms of the coming back to full circle to like, how can people, idiots like me, do something of value? And I'm trying to steer away from the bearded, how dead I can get, check out how heavy the sledge was and what I've done, and isn't that great? And the sorts of expeditions that excite me in the future are taking groups of young people down there to tell this story to their peers in the sort of language and the media that they're used to consuming. So I think that's where the value is. It's a rambling answer, sorry.
No, not at all. What about you, Henrietta? I mean, what do you think the value is of polar exploration today?
Yeah, I completely agree, actually. I think I saw a really lovely quote from Preet earlier that said that she was interested because it meant that she would encourage people to push boundaries and believe in themselves. And I just thought, like, yeah, if you're doing anything, that's why you should be doing it. It's such a perfect encapsulation, I think, of why it's still important now. And I mean, I was thinking earlier today about kind of polar firsts, and last year I think that was the creation of the Polar Expeditions Classification Scheme, which basically means that you can specifically work out, using each individual word, how you could be the first person to do something. And I think that's such a human need. It's the human need to be the very, very first person who's done exactly this way of doing things, and I've worked it all out, and it's legit. And I think it shows us how important we still find those expeditions and still find being the first person, both on the scale of humanity and on an individual scale. And so I think if you can encapsulate that, and as Ben said, kind of use it for good and use it for positive storytelling, and you can inspire people through doing these amazing things, then I really think that's exactly what we should be doing. It's like Dwayne Fields and Phoebe Smith and the We2 Foundation, and they're taking groups of underprivileged young people to the Antarctic for exactly these reasons. It's about giving people confidence and resilience and endurance and all those things that we associate with our heroic age explorers. And I think that's such a powerful reason to be doing these things, which sounds just mad, but there's a real I think emotional kind of value to them.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd absolutely agree. Well, we've got lots of questions building up in the comments I see. So let's take some of those and from our audience and see what you have to say. So Helen has got in touch and said, "What is the difference between polar heroism and polar foolhardiness? I was horrified when I visited Elephant Island in the polar summer." Henrietta, do you want to pick that one up first?
Yeah, I love that. I think I might, maybe if I can weave that into my thesis somewhere, I definitely will, because I think the line is paper thin, if I'm honest. And I do also think that is kind of what makes it heroic. We were talking a little bit earlier about whether risk is inherent to heroism, whether you can be a hero without kind of taking risk. And I think, as much as I'd like to say, no, you can be a hero in different ways, and I think actually in this instance, the world is so small now, and people are able to look at the Antarctic on Google Maps and see it in its entirety, and it feels like, okay, well, are you a hero if I can just look at it from my living room? And so the difference between whether you're a hero or an explorer, even, it is quite a fine thing. And I think maybe now, in order to be a hero, in order to get that kind of great feeling behind you, you do need to take risk, and I think often that can lead into foolhardiness, whether you intend it to, which I imagine mainly they didn't. I think they are kind of quite clear siblings in the history of Antarctica, whether intended or not. But yeah, I think that's such a great question, and absolutely, the more you find out about it, and the more you think about Shackleton on his we have a picture, I think, of the James Caird. The more you think about Shackleton on this for 800 miles, the more you think, maybe foolhardiness was the thing. So yeah, I think they're closer than comfortable.
I think that's right, isn't it? I mean, Ben, failure is just a hair's breadth from triumph, isn't it? We've seen that over and over in heroic hero, but also more recently. I mean, what's your take on that? Where's the line drawn between heroism and foolhardiness?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't really have a glib answer, sadly. I forget the philosopher. Somebody said something wonderful, that almost everything we do is ludicrous to somebody somewhere. I in a sense, my entire career is sort of indefensible on that front. Utterly pointless. I didn't discover any poles. I just got cold and hungry and tired and exhausted and was sort of showing off in a way. But I mean, going back to the preach thing, I hope that there was some value. For years, I thought, well, I've got to raise money for a charity. I've got to sort of give it some sort of validation somehow. And I was thinking about Ellen MacArthur, who inspired me enormously, particularly wanting to do solo expeditions early on, and as someone who she proved undoubtedly that risky solo, dangerous things actually could be really good things for sponsors to do. So that helped me enormously. But I often think about Ellen MacArthur's feats as an explorer, as an absolute pioneer in her field, and the work that she does now with her foundation, like which has inspired more people. Actually, it's probably 50-50. Like her sailing career was in some ways, I mean, if selfish is the right word, but it took me a long time to realize the impact what I was doing was having on the people that cared about my mum particularly. And Penn Haddow and I talked about this because his wife was fine with his expeditions, but his mum was terrified. And Penn's theory is that mums think of the sort of 11-year-old Ben, sort of with his little lunchbox and heading out into the Arctic on his own and polar bears and things. So it's in my case, it's been a for many years, a pretty sort of tunnel vision focus on these big expeditions, to the detriment and exclusion of a lot of other stuff. Navigating that boundary between being, I always wanted to try to, once I figured out I could do it, and I could sort of come home without losing any fingers and not dying, and once I figured out I could cope out there, then the exciting thing was, okay, well, what can I do? How can I raise the bar here? How can I sort of chip away at the limits of this field that's excited me and inspired me since I was a kid? And navigating that boundary between being, bold and innovative and progressive and courageous, and being reckless is really challenging. And I don't think I've ever stepped too far over it. I've come home, from many expeditions unsuccessful. I've sort of pulled the pin on 3 North Pole attempts from the Canadian side on my own because, equipment failure, weather wasn't right. So I've always erred on the side of getting home again, I think.
And I suppose getting back to Shackleton, it's knowing when to stop, when to turn around, when to, chuck in the towel on the great goal and go home. I think.
I was going to say, I do fear there's something about these experiences that is addictive as well. It's perhaps like having some horrendous drug habit. Once you've experienced what it's like on a good day, most of the time it's hellish, but when it's good, it is so good that nothing else compares. And it can, certainly did in my life for years. It can consume all the money you can get your hands on, ruin every relationship you ever had, just to make you utterly unemployable. But it's addictive, and to most people from the outside, it sounds hellish. So it's a peculiar calling, and I guess I'm feeling sort of slightly smug these days that I've got no wish to, at the moment anyway, put my sledge harness on and try and break another record. Like I've done what I wanted to, and I'm not sure that's true for many of the characters that contemporary characters in the field that I looked up to as a teenager, who are still going now, and you get the impression some of them are still longing for one more record, one more big hit.
Indeed. Okay, let's take another question. Okay, Dr. Vic Heaney says, what influence do you think the photographs they brought back of particularly the Endurance expedition fueled the power of the stories upon their return? Henrietta, do you want to take this one?
Oh my goodness. I think the Endurance expedition is such a good example as well, because for those who don't know, there are very few images of the Endurance because the Endurance itself, the Shackleton ship, was crushed by the force of the sea ice. And so Shackleton and all of his men had to take off all of their belongings quickly before it was completely destroyed. And then they had to transfer all of them onto little lifeboats, which they, took with them on the sea ice. And then they eventually rowed to Elephant Island. So the allowance of each man had a specific weight allowance, and the big kind of glass old-fashioned plates for the photographs just didn't make the cut. And so Shackleton literally stood over the photographer and watched him smash up all the pictures that he'd taken thus far, because they couldn't take them with them. And so I think there's something in the rarity of those pictures from that expedition in particular, which makes people really kind of connect with them. I think if you see, that one picture of the lifeboat that we've seen, or there's this one picture of which I think we have as well, of the shelter that they lived in on Elephant Island, who it is, and they're almost like these tiny little kind of tidbits of that, like these little gold coins of what it must have been like, and so much is left unsaid. And so I think they were really influential. I mean, they still are today. And yeah, you can see at the time, these were the tiny little tidbits of information about something that was really heavily reported on in the news. And so, of course, they would really be the kind of emotional heart, I think, of the how it was seen by everyone who wasn't there, including us today. So I think their importance can't be overestimated in a way.
And it goes back to your point, doesn't it, Ben, of Shackleton particularly being an excellent communicator. And he understood the role of PR and the story both afterwards. And I suppose his was a particular need for him, because he needed to raise the funds to cover the costs, didn't he, when he got back?
Absolutely. Yeah, I got slated a few years ago. I put a sort of photo of a Land Rover, where a big expedition sponsor. I put on Instagram, or I can't remember, Twitter or something, and a picture of a new car, because I was committed to doing that. And I got a load of flack saying, "Oh, Explorers, now you sold out." Somebody emailed me a photo. I can't remember if it was from the Nimrod expedition. They took a car down because William Beardmore, they named the glacier after, had a business making cars, and they took one down there just for a photo shoot. Like it didn't even work in Antarctica. So kind of, it's maybe it hasn't changed all that much. And you're absolutely right. I mean, Shackleton had sponsor commitments in the way that ITV's did. But yeah, beyond that, I mean, Hurley's photographs, Ponting's photographs, just having tried to take photographs in those places, it's really hard, even with a little 21st century camera. So I'm in awe of the commitment that those photographers had, and the work they did, and how cold their hands must have been.
Quite.
On a little side note to that, I just remembered that we have another fantastic photograph that I really want you to see, which is of Clissold making some bread on the Terra Nova expedition. And I think this is such a nice example of how dangerous life was, because here he is making bread, seemingly very safe in his little hut with all of his tins and things. But actually, Clissold was sent home for the second kind of season of this expedition because Ponting had asked him to pose for a photograph on an iceberg, and he'd slipped and given himself concussion, and so he had to go home. And so I really think it's like kind of symptomatic of how just dangerous it was for everybody. Even this seemingly cozy little domestic scene, it really, it was the Antarctic, and it was and it is a dangerous place to live day-to-day life.
I also love the reminder of how young most of them were. He looks like a cool dude. That could have been in a trendy cafe in the Shoreditch somewhere. They were young. It was adventure.
Making his sourdough, yes, indeed. I love that you brought his baker's hat. That's wonderful. Okay,
every essential.
Absolutely, yes. Okay, another question. So Ken, written in, given the point about heroes needing teams to be heroic, how does someone who didn't have a team of supporters like John Ray from Orkney figure in the annals of polar heroism? Is this one, Henrietta, do you want to pick this one?
Yeah, I think this is the thing. It's like we think of these individuals as acting entirely alone, especially if they went somewhere alone. And I understand how that happens, because they were on their own, and so you kind of forget about the support team behind the scenes. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't, as we've discussed with Shackleton, there weren't people fundraising. There weren't people fundraising even while they were still on their expeditions, especially with Shackleton. That was Emily Shackleton's life then became continuing to fundraise while he was away, and there are all of these support networks, even the people who the people who sent out the rations, the people who decided on the rations, what was the best thing to feed everybody, and what are the best things to take with you, and what is the best, most effective piece of kit for this particular problem that you're facing. Even if the actual expedition is a solo expedition, there's a huge cast of players, and so that is, I think, what we can look at, and that is what will make these histories more interesting, by including these other people who don't get their namesakes or the history books in quite the same way.
I'd agree. Any comment from you, Ben, on this one?
No, I thought that popped into my head, and I'm ashamed to say I don't know an awful lot about John Ray. But Tom Crean is the other story that sort of, as someone who, served is the right word, served with, Scott and Shackleton. But I gave a talk for Christmas to a primary school just down the road from us, and I love talking to schools. You get the best questions, and what is like 9-year-old kid? He said, he put his hand out. He said, "Do you have any regrets?" And I thought, "Gosh, wow, okay." And the only thing I could think of really was that I hadn't done a better job of recognizing and celebrating like the huge team of people that had helped me do every single one of these expeditions. And the Scott expedition alone, we had 12 people working full time as a business. I'd sort of inadvertently become the CEO of this weird thing where I was the boss, but I was also the product as well. And beyond that, dozens and dozens of sort of volunteers and people, giving up their time and their wisdom for nothing. So I think as Henrietta made the point that the paradox of a solo expedition, for me, having done some big trips on my own, the weird thing is that the more physically isolated you are, the more absolutely reliant you are on the people in the background. You're trusting them with your life. So yeah, remote working is something I've done a bit of, but the team is it's vital.
Yeah. So great credit to the teams. I think it was needed, I suppose. Okay, I think we've got time for one. We're going a little bit over, but I think we've got time for one more question before we wrap up. I appreciate all the hundreds of questions that we've got here, and hopefully we've answered many of them. But Bonnie has asked, maybe polar survivors are best suited to go to Mars. Long, cold, and harsh journey. Ben, did you fancy a trip to Mars? A one-way ticket?
Yeah, maybe 10 years ago, I probably was signed up. I was married now. I'm just getting old and lazy. I'm settled down in a house in Gloucestershire. 2 dogs. I think it would appeal to me. Again, a sort of slightly more serious point. I think Antarctica is a really interesting, and I'm a huge geek. I think I was inspired as much as a kid by science fiction, and indeed by when I was growing up, it's the sort of shuttle missions and then building the space station. I love that stuff. So I think I was probably a frustrated astronaut, and to me the polar regions were a relatively low budget way of perhaps experiencing what it might be like on a different planet. And I still think that's true. And actually I think Antarctica is a really, really interesting test bed, for want of a better word, for the if people are going to get to Mars one day and survive Mars, well, winter in Antarctica, 24-hour darkness, -60, -70, -80 ambient air temperatures, pretty good place to train and prepare and also test and prove the sort of technology we're going to need. So I think as well as clearly we're sort of looking back at Edwardian heroic age. But I think looking forwards, Antarctica metaphorically is a really interesting launchpad to other planets.
A lot of synergies, aren't there, I think, between space exploration and Antarctic exploration. I mean, historically, Henrietta, do you think, that these things really chime?
Yeah, definitely. I was just kind of amusing myself by wondering whether Shackleton would like to go to Mars, and I think I've decided that he probably wouldn't, because he'd like to come home and tell everyone how good he was.
Maybe the moon.
Yeah, maybe that's the difference. Yeah, maybe the moon.
Brilliant. Well, it's definitely up, but I want to say thank you to you both. But my final question to each of you is what's the future for heroism in Antarctica? So Henrietta, what do you think? What are we looking forward to? Do you think in terms of heroism? Is it still a thing?
I think so. And I think that what I really feel about heroism is that it changes dependent on the people who are looking at heroes. And so for us today, heroism, I think, is based around these ideas that we've been discussing about diversity and inclusion, but also about the greatest challenge that we're facing today, which is the climate crisis. And so I think it is those scientists who are working in the Antarctic, it's those people who are pushing forward the things that matter to us today, that I think are the heroes in Antarctica at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you. And Ben, what about you? What do you think?
Oh gosh, yeah. I think, and I hope it's and sort of paradoxically, having been talking about sort of Edwardian heroes, I hope that it's a sort of collective, collaborative story of human heroism and the human ability to sort of persevere when the chips are down. And I was waffling earlier about the fact that Antarctica, nobody owns it, passport doesn't matter, all that kind of stuff. But oh gosh, I've completely lost my thread. But yeah, that's what I hope, that we can all learn from this place, and from the way, in many ways, Antarctica doesn't care who you are, where you came from, where you're born, how much money you've got. It's in some ways desperately harsh, but in other ways, it's the ultimate sort of equalizer of humans, and so reminds us all that we're all sharing the same planet. We're all we're all still fighting about the wrong stuff. Like we talk about equality, diversity. Like there's demonstrably less genetic diversity in the entire human race than in chimpanzees. So we all share common ancestors. So I kind of hope that Antarctica is part of the story of us getting our whatever together and sort of getting on a bit better as a species.
I'd agree, and probably also I think to take care of Antarctica the best way we can. Do you agree? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you both hugely so much for sharing your expertise, your insights. I mean, fascinating to get your two different perspectives. I think feels like there's still a need and a place for heroism in Antarctica and in other places. So thank you so much. I want to say thank you all to all of you watching from home for joining us tonight and for sharing your questions. I'm sorry we didn't answer all of them, but hopefully we've touched on many of the questions that were posed, but we'll have a look at them and maybe try and answer some in the chat. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I've really enjoyed this evening. It's been great. Please let us know what you thought of it tonight. Leave your comments or below, or do get in touch with us by email or social media. We'd love to hear from you. And lastly, thank you very much to our sponsor, Viking Cruises, for supporting the whole season of Antarctica In Sight Live. Without you, we couldn't do it. So if you haven't already, those of you in the audience, please do consider supporting our work at UKAHT. We do vital work in conserving heritage on the Antarctic Peninsula and telling their stories. So please do think about becoming a member. As you see on screen now, Dr. Penguin is a great way, a really fun way to support our work, or even become a Port Lockery patron. It all helps us continue to secure the legacy of all those heroes that have gone before us in Antarctica. You can find out more details in the link in the comments or visit our website. So just looking ahead, this is the second in our programme of 6 webinars of Antarctica In Sight Live. And our next one will be on the 31st of January, when we'll be delving into geopolitics and considering the future of the Antarctic Treaty, which has been in law for 60 years. So we're privileged to have Professor Klaus Dodds will be with us, and he'll be in conversation with Sumit Paul Chowdhury, exploring those first 60 years of the treaty and what its future might contain. So it really will be a fascinating conversation. So please join us for that. You can sign up from the link in the chat. I'm hoping that's being posted now. Or please do go to our website. But for now, thank you everybody for making such an enjoyable evening, and I look forward very much to seeing you at the next Antarctica In Sight Live. Thank you and good night.
Bye.